What's a time in your life when no one listened to you, but in the end, you were absolutely right? My brother inherited a house and decided to sell it to his friend. I told him it was super important to do everything by the book, go through the bank, get a mortgage, sign all the paperwork, just like you would with a total stranger. But no, because it was his friend, my brother just signed away his rights to the property, and they agreed with a handshake that the friend would pay him monthly over the next 30 years. Guess what? A couple years later, the friend passed away. Suddenly, his wife completely forgot about their little handshake deal. Now she's living in a nice house that she basically got for free. One time, my younger brother and I were biking to the store. He said he wanted to try riding with his arms crossed over the handlebars. I strongly told him not to do it. Of course, he tried it anyway, and guess what? We had to add band-aids to our shopping list. I worked at an auto repair shop where the manager would estimate repairs, order the parts, and then send the customers home until the parts arrived. Personally, I hated pre-ordering parts too risky. In my opinion, This went on for months, and the parts just kept piling up in the back. I kept bringing it up to both our director and the shop manager, saying, "Hey, some of these parts have been here so long we can't even return them anymore." They didn't care at all. "Don't worry about it," they'd say. A few more months go by, the manager quits, and the new guy starts calling customers to come in for their repairs. Turns out, most of them had already gotten their cars fixed somewhere else. Some had even been in accidents and scrapped their cars, others sold or traded them in. In the end, the shop had to write off tens of thousands of dollars in losses, all because they didn't listen to me from the start. Right after COVID hit, everyone at my job switched to working remotely. I noticed one of my team members was logging hours for work he clearly wasn't doing. My boss accused me of micromanaging and told me, "You just need to trust your team." I did trust her, but at the same time, I started tracking how often this guy was actually logging into the system. Eventually, she realized he was only working 4 hours a week max, and it was taking him over a month just to make a one-line change in the code. Once the truth came out, they finally admitted I was right and took action. I used to work as a project manager at a major printer company. My job was to launch direct shipping from our factory in Mexico to customers in the US under an AFTA. About 3 months in, another department decided to do the exact same thing. I started attending their meetings, thinking we could team up and tackle all the legal and border crossing issues together. For 6 weeks, all they talked about was the potential benefits. They hated my follow-up questions. Eventually, I told my boss, who was 2 levels above me, that I wasn't wasting my time with them anymore. I'd just focus on my own project. 5 months later, their team was shipping out 30 trucks a day, while I hadn't even sent out my first shipment. My director called me in and chewed me out for being too slow. I didn't get it. How did they get government approvals and US customs clearance so fast? My project was 3 weeks behind. 6 weeks later, I finally send my first truck, but it gets stuck at the border for 3 days, tons of calls, paperwork, total headache. But it finally made it to the customer. After that, my shipments went smoothly, 3 trucks a day, barely any delays. A week later, I found out that the other department had stopped shipping completely. 150 of their trucks were stuck at the border, with millions of dollars of goods that never reached customers. It took them 7 months to clear their first shipment. The whole mess cost them about $5 million and a ton of unhappy clients. My project, meanwhile, saved the company $500,000 by year's end and eventually $3 million a year going forward. A few weeks after that, I went back to my director and said my project took longer because we actually knew what we were doing and did it right. He quietly agreed. I was bored one day and started flipping a really dull knife onto my foot. My friend saw me and said, "That's dangerous. You know." I just shrugged and said, "This knife is so dull it can barely cut a banana." It wouldn't even go through my apron. To prove my point, I tossed the knife with a little more force and it stuck right in my foot. Turns out, even a really dull knife can still be sharp. I used to work for a company that organized adventure trips and hiking excursions for private school students, usually 3 to 5 days long. We hired a guy who seemed super experienced in the outdoors to join our team. From day one, I had a feeling this dude just did whatever he wanted, expected everyone else to work around his schedule, and acted like it was a privilege to be on his trip. I noticed he was slacking off and sometimes doing things I thought were straight up unsafe, especially since we weren't just hiking by ourselves. We had clients, and this was our job. I raised these concerns with my boss more than once, but he always just brushed it off since nothing bad had happened yet. After about a year, I couldn't take it anymore. I filed a formal complaint, listed all the safety issues, and pointed out that I'd brought this up before and now wanted it on record. Wouldn't you know it, literally the next day, this guy leads a group of students into an area I'd repeatedly warned about tough to access in case of emergency and lets them swim in a river that was way too rough. Half the group gets swept away and separated. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but one girl was injured and had to be evacuated, which was nearly impossible because of their location and the fast current. Later, I found out both halves of the group thought the other half had died. It took hours before the instructor was able to contact the students who hadn't been swept away. I love adventure, that's why I love this job, but there were so many red flags that both this guy and my boss just ignored. I had a coworker, let's call her Tina, who was super proud to say she'd been clean for 6 months. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, was still using and basically living out of his car. Tina had her own apartment, but he'd already broken in several times looking for stuff to sell for his next fix. Another coworker and her boyfriend became friends with Tina and eventually offered to let her stay at their place. I told them it was a bad idea. Tina hadn't been clean that long, and her boyfriend had already shown he'd break into places for drugs. If he'd do it to her, he'd do it to anyone. Their lease was almost up, but they had a new place lined up a couple towns over. They told Tina she could live in their old apartment for the last month, but she'd have to leave after that. A month later, they come back. Tina's back with her boyfriend, using again, and they'd basically cleaned out the apartment. I only found out from another coworker. When I asked why they hadn't told me themselves, he said, "They're just too embarrassed to admit you were right." I'm a teacher. One time, our district administrators dropped by my classroom to observe how the kids worked in groups. They noticed one boy sitting by himself and immediately asked why he wasn't working with a group. I told them he can't. They pushed back, like, "What do you mean he can't?" Of course he can. I just looked at them and kept teaching. Not 2 minutes later, we're going over a math problem. I check his work and say, "Double check your multiplication, there's a mistake in the second row." He immediately yells, "No, it's right," and throws his chair. I just looked at our guests and shrug. Yep, this kid goes to behavior therapy for aggressive outbursts. For now, he has to sit apart from the other students. I was the operations manager at a tiny family business, working 80+ hours a week with almost no real days off. We hired a new employee who just couldn't handle even the simplest tasks and constantly distracted me while I was trying to do my own job. I told him to go talk to our boss. She actually knew what to do in his situation. That same day, I get called into the office. They asked me if I think I'm overpaid. I asked what they meant, and they said, "I just don't think you're worth what we pay you if you can't handle your responsibilities." I asked if this was because I'd sent the new guy to them about his contract. They said it was lazy and unprofessional to send anyone to the boss just because you're busy. I stepped outside to clear my head and immediately got a call for an interview for a job I'd applied for a year ago, with much better pay. I went to the interview that same day, got the job, came back to the office, and handed in my notice. I told them, if you don't think I'm worth it, fine, but you're going to need to hire at least 4 people to replace me. 2 months later, they'd hired 5 people just to handle the workload I used to do alone. My friend kept complaining about how stingy her husband was. He refused to let her make any big purchases. They had separate bank accounts, and he had 0 expensive hobbies or addictions, but somehow his money was always disappearing. I told her, he probably has a second family. She got mad, told me I was out of line, didn't know what I was talking about, and should mind my own business. 5 months later, surprise, his mistress stopped being able to pay her bills. And all of a sudden, honey, I've got a great idea, let's combine our finances. In Australia, there's a system of industry-wide wage agreements that set minimum pay rates for entire sectors. Companies can negotiate their own contracts, but only if those are better for employees. I'd worked at a company for over 3 years when they suddenly brought in a new manager and got rid of the old one without explanation. That annoyed a lot of us, including me. I asked the new manager which agreement I was under. A week later, he gives me paperwork saying I'm classified as a warehouse worker under a wool handling agreement, which made no sense since we did lighting for events and I was often on site. I went to the government's database and found out we were actually covered by the entertainment industry agreement. So not only did they lie, but they'd been underpaying me for almost 2.5 years. I filed a complaint with the authorities, complete with years of timesheets and pay stubs. I'd saved everything since I worked alone on Saturdays and had office access. The government tried mediation first, but the company ghosted them after 1 meeting. So I took them to court for underpayment. When word got around, staff at other branches started treating me like scum. Then they fired me, so I sued again for retaliation. The company settled the retaliation case, but the original suit was still active. I won, the judge ripped into them, and they were ordered to pay me every cent plus interest. Everyone at the company saw me as even more of a villain. 2 years later, the company went bankrupt. Turns out they hadn't paid pension contributions for a decade, and all those co-workers who hated me missed out on tens of thousands in retirement savings. Years later, someone mentioned the company on an industry forum, and an ex-colleague wrote, "I guess I'll never see my pension." All I replied was, "I could say something here, but I'll stay quiet." Back in undergrad, in the early 2010s, I was part of a research group in physics. We went on a trip to LIGO, the huge experiment trying to detect gravitational waves, which had never been observed before. One guy in my class was super arrogant and wouldn't shut up about how pointless the whole project was, always saying it was doomed to fail. I kept telling him, "Look, the people running this are way smarter than us. If they think it's possible, there must be a chance." He called me an idiot for believing gravitational waves could ever actually be detected. Fast forward to 2015, gravitational waves were finally observed, and later, the discovery won a Nobel Prize. I felt as a good "I told you so," but honestly, I just said it to myself in my head because I really couldn't stand him enough to reach out. So yeah, Jeff, you were wrong, and I was right. I refuse to eat the mushrooms my husband's relatives picked. These people have never read a book, let alone a mushroom guide. Guess who ended up spending the night in the hospital? The mushrooms weren't poisonous, but they definitely weren't edible. The best part, the rest of the family tried to keep it a secret, but of course everyone found out anyway. I started working at a dog daycare after moving to a new city. I had experience and proper training. Every new dog got a free trial day to see if the place was a good fit. One time, we got a 65-pound dog who was put in a kennel to settle in. I went in to give him water, and he made it very clear he wanted me out. I backed off, closed the door, and told the supervisor he shouldn't stay. He wasn't safe. My supervisor said I was overreacting even though he knew I had years of experience. He went into the kennel himself. He was way taller than me, about 6'3". He tried to approach the dog, who immediately bit him, drew blood. The supervisor left for the hospital, told the front desk to call the owner, and the dog finally got to go home happy, safe. The supervisor, not so much. I just smiled to myself. I got hired at an engineering firm that was breaking into a new market they didn't really understand. They brought in a super junior engineer to design a structural system. He used metal that was way too thin for a system meant to hold 4,000 pounds. I immediately said, this thing will probably break in a year or two under cyclic loads, and that's a serious safety issue. About a year and a half later, the structure did collapse. No one got hurt, but watching the managers and engineers scramble to cover their tracks was wild. My grandparents' roof started to look really bad. Tiles were literally falling off whenever their yard helper swept up there. I kept telling my grandpa the roof needed serious repairs. He always said I didn't know what I was talking about, that everything was fine since it wasn't leaking. Eventually, I told him, sure, it's not leaking now, but if you wait, you'll end up paying for a new roof and for water damage repairs. My grandma agreed and insisted he call someone to check it out. Turns out, the roof was in terrible shape and was already leaking. What could have been a simple fix turned into a full roof replacement and major repairs. I was standing there when the roofer showed my grandpa all the broken tiles. Grandpa just sighed, looked at me, and said, well, go on, don't hold back. I just said, told you so. Maybe next time you'll take me seriously, Grandma chimed in. Oh, don't worry, I'll make sure he does. My ex-husband never had chickenpox as a kid, and for 13 years I kept telling him he should get vaccinated. It's way worse for adults. He always brushed it off, came up with excuses, and after our first child was born, he'd just say, yeah, I'll do it, but never actually did. 10 years went by. He finally caught chickenpox and got really sick. He almost had to be hospitalized, and his new partner, who was pregnant, had to move out for a while. He couldn't work for weeks. I have to admit, I got some serious satisfaction out of that I told you so moment. My mom passed away, and my dad was left alone, living way out in the middle of nowhere. He signed up for a dating site and somehow ended up on ChinaLOV.com, met a woman in her 60s who, in her photo, looked about 18. He paid for every chat and message translation, told us all about her, and then announced he was flying to China to meet her. Our whole family told him it was a scam, but he didn't listen. He came back 6 weeks later with a woman about 65 and immediately married her. Over the next couple years, she brought her entire family over, and he started spending his whole pension buying baby formula to send to China, while also supporting all her relatives who'd moved in here. He's way too embarrassed to admit he got scammed, so he'll just keep letting her drain him dry until there's nothing left. I used to work at a busy gas station, mostly closing shifts. My manager always scheduled just 2 people for closing, then wondered why we never finished all the tasks with so many customers coming in. I kept telling him we needed more staff at night. He knew we had a ton of customers, but insisted we just needed to be more efficient. He said other stores in our chain managed with just 2 people at close, so we should too. One day in his office, we're going back and forth about it again, and he's like, let me show you the official staffing recommendations. He pulls up the document, and we both go silent. The chart says our store is supposed to have 5 people on duty until closing, not 2. I just looked at him. He got a little awkward, like, well, maybe we should try to get more people on evenings. To his credit, after that he did try to add more staff, but we were always short anyway. Still, it was nice to know I'd been right all along. I found out that the woman who saved the original Star Wars from being a total mess, Marsha Lucas, George Lucas's ex-wife shares my opinion about the prequels and sequels. She thinks they suck too. She even won an Oscar for editing A New Hope. Honestly, even if I won the lottery, I couldn't buy validation that good. Back in high school, my friend worked at a fast food joint and hated his manager because she wouldn't let him slack off. One day, he just up and left in the middle of his shift to go to a party. I told him, if you're gonna quit, at least finish your shift and talk to your manager so you don't screw her over. He ignored me and showed up at the party still in his uniform. Years later, after college, he goes to interview for a real job. Guess who's doing the hiring? Yep, his old manager. It was the shortest interview of his life. My ex-husband had anger issues and hit me more than once. After I left him, he told everyone I was making it up, that he never touched me and I was just a liar. Thing is, I had photo evidence. When we finally settled everything in court, I looked him straight in the eye and said, if you ever lay a hand on a woman again, everyone will know what a liar you are. So you'd better learn to control yourself. I'll never forget the look on his face. He never hit anyone again. Now he's married to my best friend's sister, and honestly, I'm happy for them. I once had to go back to my hometown for a family emergency, and my manager stuck me on the morning shift at the last minute without telling me. I missed that shift. It was the only one I'd ever missed. After that, my manager started treating me horribly just because of that one absence. One day I stopped by the store to use my employee discount. The manager was there, made up some excuse not to let me use the discount, then suddenly asked, why didn't you show up for your shift last Monday? I told him I knew for a fact I hadn't been scheduled the day. I always check the schedule after what happened. He goes to the back, brings out the paper schedule, and points to a name. It wasn't mine. It was the only other black girl who worked there. Different name, looked nothing like me except for our skin color. The manager apologized, gave me double the discount, and started treating me way nicer after that. Thanks for scrolling with us. Subscribe for more of the internet's craziest, most heartwarming, and most unbelievable stories every week.